A werewolf shifter romance, specially written for you. Prologue. The mud was like ice between my toes, but I didn't complain. I never complained. Not since the day the earth reclaimed my father, leaving me in the hollow, silent house with a woman who looked at me like I was a stain on her hardwood floors. "Keep up, Lyra," Marlowe hissed, her voice a jagged blade in the freezing night air. Her hand was clamped around my wrist, her fingernails digging into my skin so hard I feared she might draw blood. "Stepmother, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. I was 8 years old, and my world had shrunk to the size of my bruised heart. It's dark. The forest. The border. We aren't supposed to be here. The Alpha says it's dangerous. Marlowe didn't slow down. She didn't even look back at me. Her blonde hair, usually so perfect, was disheveled by the biting wind. "The Alpha doesn't know what's best for this pack, child, but I do. I'm taking you to a place where you'll finally be useful." Useful. The word felt heavy and cold. At 8, I knew I was a burden. I was the orphan of the Silverpaw pack, the girl whose parents died in a tragic accident that no one would talk about. I was the girl who ate the scraps and slept on the floor. We reached the edge of the territory, where the ancient pines gave way to a desolate, rocky clearing. A man stood there, silhouetted against the pale, uncaring moon. He was massive, draped in heavy furs that smelled of damp earth and old blood. Beside him stood a black horse, its breath huffing out in white clouds. "You're late, Marlowe," the stranger said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that made the hair on my arms stand up. "The girl was slow," my stepmother replied, her voice suddenly smooth, almost sweet. She shoved me forward. I stumbled, my knees hitting the sharp stones. I looked up at her, my eyes swimming with tears. "Marlowe? Why is he looking at me like that? Where are we going?" She didn't answer me. Instead, she looked at the man. "The coin? You promised double because of her lineage." The man reached into his cloak and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it. The sound it made, the rhythmic clink-clink of heavy gold, was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of my life being sold. I felt a sudden, strange hum in my veins. It wasn't my wolf. It was too early for that. It felt like silver fire, a thrumming vibration in my marrow that made the pebbles around my hand vibrate. For a split second, the air around me felt warm, almost glowing. The man froze. His eyes narrowed, locked onto my hands. A dark, greedy smile spread across his face. "Ah, so the rumors were true. There is something in her blood." "Take her," Marlowe said, her voice cold as the grave. She turned her back on me, clutching the money to her chest, as if it were the child she had never wanted. "Marlowe, please don't leave me," I screamed, reaching out for her. She didn't look back. She walked toward the pack territory, already rehearsing the lie she would tell the Alpha. She ran away, she would say. She couldn't handle the grief. I tried to stop her, but she vanished into the night. The man's heavy hand landed on my shoulder. It felt like a mountain collapsing on me. "Stop your crying, little bird," he growled, dragging me toward the horse. "You belong to Silas now, and I intend to get every cent of my money's worth out of you." As I was lifted onto the horse, I looked back one last time at the home I was being stolen from. The silver fire in my blood flickered and died, leaving me in total, absolute darkness. I was 8 years old. I had been sold for a bag of gold. And for the first time in my life, I realized that the monsters weren't just in the woods. They were the people who were supposed to love you. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I am so excited to be sharing this brand new, emotional journey with you. This is the story of a girl who lost everything only to find a power she never knew she possessed. New here? If you love deep, emotional werewolf stories with a mix of betrayal and ultimate triumph, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Where are you watching from? I love seeing how far our pack reaches. Let me know in the comments. What country or city are you watching from today? Let's talk. What is your first impression of Marlowe? Do you think she'll get what's coming to her, or is she too clever for her own good? Drop your opinions in the comments below. Chapter 1. The house still smelled like my father's cedarwood tobacco and the wild lavender my mother used to tuck into the pillowcases, but the warmth had long since bled out of the walls. To the Silverpaw pack, this was the Alpha's mercy house, a place where an orphan could find shelter. To me, it was a tomb. I was 8 years old, and I had become a ghost in my own home. My parents had been dead for 6 months, and in that time, my stepmother Marlowe had managed to erase every trace of them. She had burned their clothes, sold my father's hunting trophies, and replaced my mother's flower garden with sharp, thorny briars. "Scrub harder, Lyra." Marlowe's voice drifted from the kitchen, sharp enough to cut glass. "The elders are coming for dinner, and I won't have them seeing the filth you leave behind. You're already enough of a stain on this family's reputation." I was on my knees in the foyer, my small hands raw from the lye soap and freezing water. Every movement made the ache in my joints flare. I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, a piece of crust Marlowe had forgotten on the counter. "I'm trying, stepmother," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the brush against the wood. "Don't call me that," she barked, appearing in the doorway. She looked radiant in a silk dress the color of a bruised plum, a dress she had bought with the money from my father's life insurance. "I am the mistress of this house. You are merely the help your father failed to provide for." She stepped closer, her heels clicking like a countdown. She looked down at me with a disgust so profound it made my stomach flip. I was small for my age, my ribs peeking through my thin shift, my hair matted despite my best efforts to comb it with my fingers. "You look just like her," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "That moon-blessed mother of yours, always acting like you're something special, always humming that strange tune." I looked down, hiding my face. My mother had told me I was special. She told me the silver light in my dreams was a gift from the goddess herself. But now that gift felt like a curse. Whenever I got too sad or too angry, the air around me would get heavy. The shadows would dance. Once, I had accidentally made a dead sprout in the kitchen window bloom into a vibrant, glowing flower just by touching it. Marlowe had seen it. Her face hadn't filled with wonder. It had filled with a terrifying, cold greed. She had ripped the flower out and burned it in the hearth, calling me a freak of nature. "The Alpha thinks you're a poor, grieving pup," Marlowe said, leaning down so her face was inches from mine. "But I see you. I see the way the lights flicker when you walk by. I see the rot in you, Lyra. You aren't a wolf. You're a monster in a little girl's skin." I felt the prickle in my fingertips, the silver fire she hated. It wanted to lash out, to push her away. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing it down. "Be quiet," I told the power. "If you stay quiet, she might leave us alone." But she didn't. That afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I heard her talking to someone at the back door. It wasn't one of our pack members. The scent was wrong. It was heavy, metallic, and smelled of the deadlands beyond our borders. "She's a healer," I heard Marlowe whisper, her voice thick with suppressed excitement. "Or she will be. I've seen her bring life to things that were dead. She's worth 3 times the price of a normal Omega." I froze, the wet rag slipping from my hands. I didn't understand what price meant. I was 8. I thought she was talking about the cattle or the grain. Then I heard the stranger's voice. "If she's what you say she is, the deal stands. But if she's a dud, Marlowe, I'll come back for my gold, and I'll take your head as interest." I didn't know then that my fate had been sealed over a cup of tea and a bag of coins. I just knew that when Marlowe walked back into the room, she didn't look angry anymore. She looked satisfied. "Go get your coat, Lyra," she said, her voice eerily calm. "We're going for a walk. I have a surprise for you." "Is it a toy, Marlowe? Or maybe one of Mama's ribbons?" I hurried to keep up with her, my small boots crunching over the frost-covered leaves. I was breathless, not just from the pace, but from a tiny fluttering hope in my chest. Marlowe had told me we were going to the Hidden Hollow, a place my father used to tell me stories about. She said he'd left a birthday gift there, something he'd hidden before the accident, meant only for when I was ready. Marlowe didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the Silverpaw territory. Something like that, Lyra. Just keep walking. We don't want to miss the timing. The further we walked, the stranger the forest felt. The cheerful chirping of the night birds died away, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The air grew colder, smelling of rot and wet iron. My inner wolf, though still a pup and unshifted, began to whimper in the back of my mind. Danger, cold, turn back. "Stepmother," I whispered, clutching the hem of my worn coat. "It's too quiet. Maybe we should come back tomorrow, when the sun is up?" She stopped abruptly. We were at the border stones, the massive, moss-covered boulders that separated our safe-pack lands from the dead lands, a lawless territory where no Alpha's protection reached. "We're here," she said. Her voice had lost that strange, fake softness. It was flat, empty. I looked around the clearing. There was no hollow, no hidden gift, only a man standing by a large black horse, his face obscured by a deep hood. "Who is that?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Marlowe, who is that man?" The stranger stepped forward. He was huge, his scent a foul mixture of stale ale and something metallic, like the blood on a butcher's apron. He held a heavy leather pouch in his hand, and as he moved, it made a rhythmic, heavy clink. "She's small," the man grunted, his voice like grinding stones. "You said she was healthy." "She's hardy enough," Marlowe replied, her voice cold. She didn't look like my family anymore. She looked like a merchant haggling over a sack of grain. "She survives on nothing. And like I told you, she has the spark." The man reached out, his gloved hand grabbing my chin and forcing my head up. His eyes were yellow and bloodshot, filled with a terrifying hunger. "Show me, little thing. Show me why you're worth a bag of gold." I shook with terror. "Marlowe! What is he saying? Let's go home, please!" I reached for her hand, but she stepped back, out of my reach. She looked at the man and nodded. He tossed the leather pouch. It landed in her palms with a dull thud. Marlowe opened it, her eyes lighting up as she saw the glint of gold coins. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. There was no gift from my father. There was no hidden hollow. You sold me," I whispered. The silver fire in my blood flared, hot and angry. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble slightly, and a faint, ethereal glow started to pulse from my fingertips. The stranger's eyes widened. There it is, the moon-blessed energy. He gripped my arm, his fingers like iron bands. "Come here, pup. You're mine now." "No!" I screamed, pulling back. For a second, the light around me brightened, a shock of silver energy pulsing outward. It wasn't enough to hurt him, but it made him hiss and stumble. Marlowe didn't even flinch. She was already tucking the gold into her bodice. "Don't struggle, Lyra. It only makes things worse. Think of it this way. You're finally doing something for this family." She turned around and began to walk back into the trees, back toward the warm house, the soft beds, and the lie she would tell the pack. "Marlowe! Mama! Daddy!" I shrieked as the stranger hoisted me onto the back of his horse, binding my wrists with rough rope. I watched her silhouette disappear into the shadows of the Silverpaw trees. I was 8 years old, sold to a stranger for a handful of gold, and as the horse galloped away into the dead lands, the only thing I had left was the silver fire burning in my veins, and a heart that had just turned to stone. Chapter 2. The Deadlands lived up to their name. Here, the sun always felt pale, filtered through the thick yellow smoke of Silas's smelting fires. His estate was a jagged scar on the side of a mountain, a place of iron and ash where hope went to die. I stood in the knee-deep freezing water of the lower wash tunnels, my hands numb as I sifted through heavy baskets of raw ore. My fingers, once small and soft, were now covered in a roadmap of scars and calluses. I had grown taller, but my frame was skeletal, my collarbones sharp enough to pierce my own skin. "Faster, Mummer 42, a guard barked from the wooden catwalk above, his leather lash biting into the surface of the water just inches from my legs. They didn't call me Lyra here. Silas had stripped me of my name the moment we crossed the border. To him, I was just a unit of labor, a moonchild he was waiting to see bloom so he could justify the gold he'd paid to Marlowe. For 3 years he had waited, and for 3 years he had grown increasingly frustrated. Still nothing? Silas's voice echoed through the tunnel. He stepped into view, his heavy fur cloak dragging in the muck. He looked older, greed having etched deep lines into his face. He looked at me with a hatred that was purely financial. 3 years of feeding you, housing you, and you're still just a scrawny brat who can barely carry a basket. I didn't look up. Experience had taught me that eye contact was an invitation for a blow. I kept my head down, my breath hitching in the damp air. "I'm working, Master Silas," I whispered, my voice raspy from the dust of the mines. "You're breathing my air and wasting my time," he roared. He stepped into the water, his heavy boots creating a wake that nearly knocked me over. He grabbed a handful of my matted hair and yanked my head back. "The woman said you had the spark. She said you were moon-blessed. But all I see is a useless orphan who can't even shift into a mangy wolf." The mention of Marlowe sent a cold shiver through me, but it was a distant pain now. The trauma had calcified. I didn't cry for my parents anymore. I didn't have the moisture in my body to spare for tears. "Maybe she lied," I croaked. Silas's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "If she lied, I'll kill you both. But first, I'll break you until you find a way to be profitable." He threw me back into the water. My head hit a jagged piece of ore, and for a moment the world went dark, spiraling into a haze of gray. In that darkness, I felt it again. It started deep in the marrow of my bones, a low, humming vibration. It wasn't the heat of a wolf's shift. It was colder, like liquid moonlight being poured into my veins. It felt ancient, heavy, and terrifyingly vast. My fingertips began to tingle with a sensation like 1,000 needles, and the shadows in the corner of the tunnel seemed to lean toward me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. "Not yet," a voice seemed to echo in my mind. "Not yet." I gasped, my eyes snapping open as I broke the surface of the water, coughing and sputtering. Silas was already walking away, barking orders to the guards to increase my quota for the night. I looked down at my hands beneath the murky water. For a split second, I saw a flicker of silver, not a glow, but a shimmering metallic sheen that danced beneath my skin like a trapped star. The spark Marlowe had sold me for wasn't a gift. As I watched the silver fade back into the gray of my bruised skin, I realized it was something much more dangerous. It was a power that was waking up because I was breaking, and I didn't know if it was meant to save me or finish what Silas had started. I reached for the next basket of ore, my body shaking. I was 11 years old, a slave in the Deadlands, and the only thing more terrifying than my master was the storm currently brewing inside my own blood. I was tasked with moving the crucibles, heavy, stone-fired pots filled with molten slag. My arms trembled with the effort, the heat blistering the skin of my face, even through the wet rags I used as a mask. "Careful with that one, girl," a voice echoed. It wasn't Silas. It was younger, deeper, and lacked the jagged edge of a threat. I looked up briefly. Standing near the ventilation grate was a boy I had seen only in passing. Caspian. He was 16 now, his frame filling out with the lean muscle of a warrior in training. He wore the fine leathers of a master's son, but his gray eyes weren't filled with the usual arrogance. He was watching me with a look I couldn't identify. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to horror. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I had to focus on the crucible. Suddenly, the floor, slick with spilled oil and sweat, betrayed me. My foot slipped. The heavy stone pot tilted. Time seemed to slow as the molten white-hot liquid began to pour over the edge, heading straight for an old slave named Bram, who was kneeling nearby, his back turned as he stoked the furnace. "Bram!" I screamed, but it was too late. The liquid fire was inches from his skin. I didn't think. I lunged forward, my bare hands reaching out not for Bram, but for the falling liquid itself. I expected the smell of burning flesh. I expected the end of my life. Instead, the world turned silent. The silver fire in my veins didn't just thrum, it exploded. My hands didn't burn. They glowed with a light so blindingly white it made the furnace fires look like dim candles. The molten iron, instead of splashing onto Bram, hit an invisible wall of shimmering energy an inch from his shoulder. But that wasn't the strange part. As the liquid metal touched the silver aura surrounding my hands, it changed. The dull orange-red glow of the iron turned into a brilliant, translucent violet. The heavy impurities of the slag vanished, and what dripped onto the stone floor wasn't waste. It was a puddle of star iron, the rarest and most expensive metal in the shifter world, a material capable of piercing an alpha's hide. I collapsed, the energy draining out of me so fast I felt my heart skip a beat. I hit the soot-covered floor, gasping for air, my hands shaking, white, unburned, and pulsing with a fading silver light. "By the goddess," Bram whispered, staring at the violet metal cooling on the floor. A heavy shadow fell over me. Silas was there. He had been watching from the shadows of the upper balcony. He didn't rush to see if I was hurt. He didn't check on the terrified Bram. He knelt by the puddle of star iron, his trembling fingers reaching out to touch the cooled, precious metal. His face transformed. The anger was gone, replaced by a terrifying, ecstatic greed. "You didn't just save him," Silas whispered, his voice trembling with a dark delight. "You purified it. You turned dirt into destiny." He turned to me, his eyes wide and hungry. He looked at me the way a wolf looks at a wounded deer. Not with hate, but with an appetite. "The woman didn't lie," he breathed. "She just didn't tell me the half of it. You aren't just a healer, girl. You're a catalyst, a fountain of gold." "Father, she's exhausted." Caspian's voice cut through the silence. He had stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his training sword. His face was tight, his jaw set. "She needs a healer. She nearly died." Silas laughed, a cold, barking sound. "She is the healer, boy, and from now on, she won't be wasting another second in these mines." He grabbed my arm, gently this time, but the grip was more terrifying than any blow. It was the grip of a man who had found his most prized possession. "Clean her up," Silas commanded the guards. "Move her to the East Tower. Give her silk, give her meat, and give her whatever she wants, as long as she produces. I have clients who will pay the price of a kingdom for a single blade forged in her light." As they dragged me away, I looked back. Silas was still staring at the violet metal, already calculating the wealth my suffering would bring him. But Caspian wasn't looking at the metal. He was looking at me. Our eyes met for a heartbeat, and in his gaze I saw the first spark of something I hadn't felt in 3 years. He didn't see a tool. He didn't see a merchant's prize. He saw a girl. And for the first time since my father died, I felt like I existed. Chapter 3. The morning sun hit the stained glass windows of my chamber, casting fractured colors across the floor. I sat at my vanity, staring at a girl I barely recognized. My hair, once matted and dull, now flowed in waves of chestnut and silver. My eyes, however, were ancient. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much of the world's greed. A heavy mechanical click echoed through the room. The iron-reinforced door swung open. Silas walked in, looking every bit the Merchant King. His fingers were heavy with rings, many of them set with the very violet star iron I had bled to create. "The client is waiting, Lyra," he said, his voice smooth, a terrifying contrast to the man who used to scream at me in the tunnels. "A high-ranking alpha from the northern tundra. He's brought his ancestral blade. It's rusted with a century of stagnant blood. He wants it purified." "I did 3 blades yesterday, Silas," I whispered, my hand instinctively going to my chest. My heart felt like it was beating in a thick silver soup. "My wolf. She's so quiet. I can't feel her anymore. Every time I touch the iron, she retreats further into the dark." Silas dismissed my concern with a wave of his hand. "Your wolf is a secondary concern. The power, the spark, is what matters. Do this, and you can have that rare honey wine you like tonight. Refuse, and we go back to the wash tunnels. I'm sure Bram misses your help." The threat was veiled, but sharp. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. The purification room was located in the heart of the tower. It was a sterile, cold chamber where a massive anvil made of white stone sat in the center. Waiting there was a massive, scarred man and Caspian. Caspian was 21 now. He had grown into a formidable warrior, his shoulders broad and his gaze piercing. He was the commander of Silas's guards, the man responsible for the security of the estate. To the world, he was the heir to a fortune built on my suffering. To me, he was the only person who didn't look at me like a pile of coins. "Position the blade," Silas commanded. Caspian stepped forward, taking the rusted black iron claymore from the northern alpha. He placed it on the anvil. As he did, his hand brushed mine. For a fraction of a second, his fingers squeezed my wrist. Not a grip of restraint, but a silent message. "I'm here. Hold on." I took a deep breath and placed my hands on the cold, corrupted iron. The silver fire didn't wait for an invitation. It surged out of my pores, a blinding, liquid moonlight that illuminated the entire room. I felt the impurities of the blade, the centuries of hate and murder stored in the metal, clash against my soul. The silver veins on my arms began to pulse. The northern alpha gasped, his eyes wide with a mix of religious awe and covetousness. Slowly, the black rust began to flake away, turning into fine violet dust. The iron beneath began to shimmer, turning translucent, then solidifying into a brilliant star iron edge that could cut through a mountain. I cried out as the final surge left me. My knees gave way, and the world began to tilt. I expected to hit the cold stone floor, but I caught the scent of pine and rain. Caspian. He had moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics, catching me before my head could strike the anvil. "She's done for today, Father," Caspian said, his voice low and vibrating with a suppressed rage that made the northern alpha step back. "She has one more," Silas started. "She is done," Caspian roared, his alpha presence flaring so violently that the glass in the windows rattled. He gathered me into his arms, lifting me effortlessly. "If you drain her dry today, you'll have nothing left to sell tomorrow. I'm taking her back to her quarters." Silas narrowed his eyes, but he knew Caspian was right. He waved us off, turning his attention back to the northern alpha to negotiate the final, exorbitant price. Caspian didn't speak as he carried me up the winding stairs. He didn't put me down when we reached my room. He sat on the edge of the bed, still holding me against his chest, his heart thudding steadily against my ear. "You have to stop letting him do this to you, Lyra," he whispered into my hair. "I have no choice, Caspian," I breathed, my voice barely a thread. "I'm an orphan. I'm a slave. I belong to him." "No," Caspian said, pulling back to look me in the eyes. His gray gaze was fierce, determined. "You belong to the moon, Lyra. And soon, very soon, I'm going to make sure the world knows it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried flower. Not a silk one, but a real one from beyond the walls. It was a simple mountain daisy. "Keep this," he said. "Remember what the world outside smells like. I'm finding a way out. I promise." As he left, locking the door behind him to maintain the facade, I clutched the tiny flower to my chest. The silver fire was quiet, but for the first time in 5 years, my wolf, the small white pup hidden in the dark, let out a tiny, hopeful howl. Restless, I moved to the window. The moon was a thin sliver, yet I could feel its pull in my marrow. My senses, usually dulled by the exhaustion of purification, suddenly sharpened. I could hear the rhythmic breathing of the guards 3 floors down. I could smell the stale ale on the breath of the stable hands. And then I heard Silas's voice. It wasn't coming from the hallway, but from the ventilation shaft behind the heavy velvet curtains. His study was directly below my chamber. Usually, the stone muffled his dealings, but tonight, the air was carrying every word with terrifying clarity. "He's coming tomorrow night, I tell you." Silas's voice was hushed, vibrating with a nervous excitement. "The price is too high, Silas," another voice replied, Gideon, his lead bookkeeper. "The girl is fading. You saw her today. She nearly collapsed. If she dies during the transfer, we lose everything. The Northern Alpha's deposit, the Star Iron contracts." "She won't die yet," Silas snapped. "But you're right about one thing. She is a depreciating asset. The purification is draining her faster than I anticipated. Her wolf is stunted, and the spark is consuming her physical form. That's why I'm selling her, all of her." I froze. My breath caught in my throat, the mountain daisy trembling on the nightstand as I leaned closer to the vent. "Selling her?" Gideon whispered. "To whom?" "The high priest of the Obsidian Coven," Silas revealed. "He doesn't want star iron blades, Gideon. He wants the source. He believes that if he drains her blood during a blood moon, he can infuse his entire legion with the moon-blessed power. He's offering enough gold to buy 10 estates like this, enough to buy a seat on the High Council. But that would kill her. It's a total extraction. She's a slave, Gideon. A tool I bought for a pittance from a greedy stepmother," Silas spat. "I've squeezed every drop of profit I can from her hands. Now I'll squeeze the rest from her heart. Better to sell her for a king's ransom now than to let her wither away into a useless corpse in 6 months." The world seemed to drop away beneath my feet. I wasn't just a battery anymore. I was a harvest. Silas wasn't waiting for me to bloom. He was waiting for the highest bidder to take my life. A shadow crossed the moonlight in my room. I spun around, a gasp dying in my throat. Caspian was standing by the door, which he had unlocked silently. His face was a mask of cold, lethal fury. He didn't look like the boy who had given me a daisy. He looked like a predator who had finally found his target. "You heard," he stated. It wasn't a question. "He's going to kill me, Caspian," I whispered, the first tear in years finally breaking free and tracking through the dust on my cheek. "He's selling my heart." Caspian crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing my shoulders. His touch was usually gentle, but now it was iron hard, grounding me. "Listen to me, Lyra. I knew he was greedy, but I didn't think he'd sink to the Covens. The Obsidian priest arrives tomorrow at sunset. The transfer is scheduled for midnight." "I have to run," I said, panic finally clawing at my chest. "I have to leave now." "You wouldn't make it past the gate," Caspian said, his jaw tight. "The guards are on high alert for the priest's arrival, but there is a way." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small silver whistle and a heavy iron key. "Tonight, we don't run. Tonight, we prepare," he whispered, leaning his forehead against mine. I could smell the storm on him, the scent of lightning and dark pine. "I've been diverting funds, Lyra. I've been making alliances with the warriors who hate my father's cruelty, but most importantly—" He pulled back, his eyes searching mine. "I need you to stop suppressing it. The silver fire. Stop fighting it. Let it take what it needs from the moon. Tomorrow, when that priest reaches for you, I want him to find a goddess, not a slave." "It hurts, Caspian," I sobbed. "The power, it burns." "I know," he murmured, pulling me into a fierce embrace. "But it's the only thing that's going to burn this prison down. I won't let him have you. I swear on my blood, Lyra, you are the only thing in this world worth saving." In the dark of the East Tower, the Gilded cage had finally become a war room. The orphan girl and the merchant's son were no longer just survivors. They were the spark and the fuel, waiting for the sun to set one last time. Chapter 4. The obsidian priest did not arrive with a carriage or the thunder of hooves. He arrived with the wind. One moment the courtyard was empty. The next, a ripple in the shadows coalesced into a figure draped in robes so black they seemed to drink the remaining light. I stood on the balcony of the great hall, hidden behind the stone balustrade as Silas and Caspian went out to meet him. From this height, the priest looked like a stain on the earth. He smelled of old graves and the bitter metallic scent of dried blood. High Priest Malphus. Silas's voice drifted up, uncharacteristically oily. He was bowing low, a gesture he usually reserved for no one. "We are honored. The vessel is prepared." "Is she?" The priest's voice was a dry rasp, like dead leaves skittering over a headstone. "I do not pay for promises, Silas. I pay for power. If the girl's blood is tainted by common sickness, or her spirit is too broken to hold the charge, our bargain ends in your blood, not my gold." I felt a shiver of pure, primal terror. This wasn't a merchant looking for a tool. This was a predator looking for a meal. "See for yourself," Silas said, gesturing toward the hall. I hurried back to the center of the room, dropping onto the plush velvet cushions they had placed there to make me look like a pampered princess. I lowered my head, letting my long hair veil my face, tucking my hands into my silk sleeves. I focused on the rhythm of my breathing, trying to dim the silver fire that was screaming to lash out. The heavy doors groaned open. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Up, girl," Silas commanded. I stood slowly, keeping my eyes on the floor. I felt the priest's presence before he even moved. He walked with a soundless grace, stopping inches from me. The air around him felt heavy and cold, like being submerged in a frozen lake. He reached out a hand. His skin was a sickly translucent gray, his fingernails sharpened into points. He didn't touch my face. He placed his palm over my heart. The spark beneath my skin didn't just itch anymore, it roared. It felt like a cornered beast, snapping its teeth at the darkness the priest carried. My veins turned a brilliant, visible silver through the thin fabric of my dress. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming as the cold from his hand clashed with the fire in my blood. "Incredible," Malphus whispered, his voice hitching with a dark, holy fervor. "The moon-blessed lineage is pure. I can feel the lunar cycle vibrating in her very marrow. She is not just a healer. She is a conduit of the goddess's own essence." "And the price?" Silas asked, his greed outweighing his fear of the creature standing in his house. "Double," the priest breathed, his eyes, void of pupils, just endless pits of black, locked onto my chest. "I will take her at the stroke of midnight. Prepare the ritual altar in the east tower. It must be under the direct light of the blood moon." Silas let out a breath of pure triumph. "Caspian, escort our guest to the dining hall. We will celebrate the finalization of our contract." Caspian stepped forward. He hadn't looked at me once since they entered the room. His face was a mask of cold, professional indifference. "This way, High Priest," he said, his voice flat. But as he passed me, his shadow fell over mine. For a split second, I saw his hand drop to the hilt of his sword, his thumb flicking the crossguard twice. Our secret signal. The pieces are in place. As they left, Silas turned to me, his face twisted into a grotesque, triumphant grin. "You've done well, Lyra. Your parents would be proud. You're finally worth something." He walked out, locking the door with a final, echoing thud. I collapsed to my knees, my hands clawing at the stone floor. The silver fire was no longer a hum. It was a symphony. I looked out the window at the moon, which was already beginning to take on a rusted crimson hue. Caspian had told me to stop suppressing it. I closed my eyes and reached out, not for the world of men, but for the celestial power above. I opened the floodgates. The silver veins on my arms didn't just pulse, they glowed, casting long, ethereal shadows against the walls. The air in the room began to swirl, a miniature gale of lunar energy that made the velvet curtains tear. I was no longer the girl who was sold. I was no longer the slave in the mines. I was the storm that was coming for them all. The rooftop of the East Tower had been transformed into a nightmare. A circular altar of black obsidian had been dragged to the center, surrounded by 12 tall candles made of rendered fat that burned with a flickering green flame. Silas stood to the side, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with the anticipation of the gold currently being loaded into his vaults. Caspian stood behind him, his face a granite mask, his hand white-knuckled on the hilt of his sword. I was led to the center, my silk gown replaced by a thin white shift that offered no protection against the biting wind. My wrists were bound in cold iron, shackles designed to dampen a wolf's spirit. "The moon reaches its zenith," Malphus hissed, his hood falling back to reveal a face covered in sigils that pulsed with a dull, necrotic light. "Lay her on the stone." Silas grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. He forced me onto the freezing obsidian. I looked up at the moon. It was no longer silver, it was a deep bruised crimson, hanging in the sky like a bleeding eye. "Do not look away, child," Malphus whispered, leaning over me. He produced a ritual dagger, a blade of jagged bone that seemed to drink the moonlight. "Your life was a small, guttering flame. Tonight, I turn it into an eternal sun for my coven." He raised the blade. "Now!" I screamed. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a command to the power I had been holding back for 8 years. The silver fire didn't just pulse, it exploded. The cold iron shackles on my wrists didn't just break, they turned to dust. The strange power finally revealed its true form. It wasn't just purification of metal, it was the purification of the will. Every ounce of corruption, every greedy thought Silas had, every necrotic spell Malphus possessed, it was all impurities in the eyes of the moon. The silver energy lanced out of me in jagged lightning-like arcs. Where it touched the green candles, they extinguished. Where it touched the obsidian altar, the stone cracked and turned to white marble. "The girl!" Malphus roared, his voice cracking with panic. "She's not a conduit! She's the source! Kill her before she stabilizes!" But Malphus never reached me. A silver steel blade erupted through the priest's chest from behind. Caspian had moved. He didn't wait for the rebellion to start at the gates. He started it here, at the heart of the rot. "You touch her," Caspian growled, twisting the blade, "and I'll send you to the hell you serve." He kicked the dying priest off the tower edge and turned his gaze toward his father. Silas was backed against the parapet, his eyes bulging as he looked at the son who had finally turned against him. "Caspian, think of the fortune. The estate," Silas shrieked. "The estate is built on the bones of orphans, father," Caspian said, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. He looked at me, and for the first time his eyes weren't gray. They were glowing with the golden light of an alpha who had finally found his purpose. And tonight, the foundation fails. Below us, the sound of steel clashing against steel erupted. The warriors Caspian had spent years secretly training were turning on Silas's loyalists. The dead lands were finally waking up. But the strain was too much. The blood moon was feeding me too much power, and my 8-year-old wolf was struggling to contain the celestial tide. My skin felt like it was peeling away, replaced by pure, blinding light. "Lyra!" Caspian dropped his sword and ran toward me, ignoring the silver arcs that scorched the stone around us. "Lyra, look at me! You have to shift! If you don't shift now, the power will burn you to ash!" "I can't!" I sobbed, my voice echoing with 1,000 lunar voices. "She's too small! She's too weak!" "She's not weak," Caspian roared, grabbing my hands, letting the silver fire sear his own palms. "She's the moon-blessed. Shift, Lyra. Claim the orphan. Claim your life." The red moon above seemed to pulse in time with my heart. Thump, thump. The silver fire reached a breaking point. With a scream that shook the very foundations of the mountain, the light collapsed inward. My bones cracked and reformed. My skin erupted in fur as white as the purest snow. The heavy, stagnant air of the Deadlands was suddenly filled with the scent of pine, rain, and the wild, untamed power of a goddess. I was no longer a girl. I was a massive, ethereal white wolf with eyes of liquid silver. I stood over the shattered altar, my fur shimmering with the starlight of 1,000 years. I looked at Silas, who fell to his knees in terror, and then at Caspian. Caspian didn't flinch. He walked up to me, his hands smoking from the burns, and rested his forehead against my snout. "I see you," he whispered. "I've always seen you." The slave was dead. The golden bird was gone. The orphan of the Silverpaw pack had finally come home to her own skin. Chapter 5. I stood on the highest balcony of the tower, the same place where the obsidian altar had once been shattered. I was 18 now. My presence was no longer that of a frightened girl, but of a woman who carried the stillness of the moon in her gaze. Caspian stepped out onto the balcony behind me. At 23, he had fully stepped into his alpha power, though he wore no crown but the scars on his hands, the marks from the night he held me through the fire. "The scouts returned from the southern border," he said, his voice a low rumble that always acted as an anchor for my soul. "There's a caravan approaching. They carry the banners of the Silverpaw pack." My heart, usually calm, gave a sharp, painful thrum. Silverpaw. The name tasted like iron and cold mud. "They come for the white goddess," I said, my voice steady despite the memories clawing at my throat. "They've heard rumors that a healer exists here who can purify the wasting curse currently rotting their alpha's lungs." "They don't know it's you," Caspian said, stepping closer until his shoulder brushed mine. "To them, Lyra died 10 years ago in the woods. They're coming to buy a miracle, just like they always do." "Then let them come," I whispered. "I want to see the faces of the people who believed a child could be erased with a bag of gold." The meeting was set for the Great Hall. I didn't hide behind a veil this time. I sat on a throne of carved white stone, draped in a gown of silver silk that shimmered like moonlight on water. Caspian stood at my right hand, his presence a silent warning to any who dared breathe too loudly. The doors opened, and a delegation of 5 wolves entered. They were dressed in the fine furs of the Silverpaw elite. At their head was a man I recognized, Elder Hakon, my father's old friend. And behind him, draped in a cloak of fine ermine, was the woman who haunted my nightmares. Marlowe. She looked older, the bitterness of her soul finally etching lines around her mouth, but her eyes were still the same, greedy, cold, and calculating. She looked around the opulent hall with an expression of intense envy, unaware that the floor she walked on was scrubbed by the very girl she had sold. "Great healer," Elder Hakon began, bowing low. "We come from the Silverpaw pack in a time of great need. Our alpha is dying. Our lands are failing. We have heard of your purification, and we offer whatever price you demand for your services." I stayed silent, watching Marlowe. She was staring at me, her brow furrowing. She saw the moon-blessed glow in my skin, a look that clearly triggered a buried memory. "You look familiar, child," Marlowe said, her voice dripping with a fake, motherly sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Have we met? You have the look of a girl who once lived in our village, a poor, troubled thing who ran away years ago." I felt the silver fire spark in my fingertips. I felt the white wolf beneath my skin growl, her fur bristling with 10 years of suppressed rage. "She didn't run away, Marlowe," I said, my voice echoing through the hall with a sudden divine authority that made the candles flicker. The delegation froze. Marlowe's face went pale, ashen like the soot of the mines. "I remember that walk to the border," I continued, standing up slowly. Every step I took toward them made the air grow heavier, the lunar energy radiating from me like a physical weight. I remember the smell of the black horse. I remember the clink of the gold coins in your hand. Lyra, Hakan whispered, his eyes wide with horror. But the story. Marlowe said you were taken by a bear. Then she said you ran. Marlowe sold me, I said, stopping inches from my stepmother. She sold an 8-year-old child to a man who used her as a battery for 8 years. She sold me for a bag of gold and a lie. Caspian stepped forward, his alpha aura flaring, pinning the Silverpaw guards to the spot. You didn't come here to find a healer, he growled. You came to find the victim of your own corruption. Marlowe stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat. I did what was best for the pack. You were a freak, a burden. I was a child, I hissed, and for a moment my eyes flashed pure, liquid silver. The great hall shook. The Silverpaw delegation fell to their knees, not out of respect, but because the very gravity in the room had increased. You want a miracle to save your alpha? I asked, looking down at the woman who had ruined my life. The price has changed, Marlowe. I don't want your gold. I want the truth, spoken before your entire pack, and I want the one who sold me to face the judgment of the moon. The gates of the Silverpaw pack, once the boundary of my entire world, looked small and weathered. As our procession entered the village square, the whispers began. The pack members gathered, their eyes wide as they saw the banners of the Silver-Spires. But the whispers turned into a deafening silence when I stepped out of the carriage. I wore a gown of white and charcoal, my hair left loose to catch the wind. I didn't look like the malnourished orphan they remembered. I looked like the moon had taken human form. Alpha Garrett is in the Great Lodge, Hakan whispered, his head bowed in shame. He is not long for this world. We entered the lodge. The air inside was thick with the scent of sickness. The wasting curse had turned the Alpha's lungs into ash. He lay on a raised dais, surrounded by his council and a trembling Marlowe who looked like she wanted to melt into the shadows. Who is this? Alpha Garrett wheezed, his eyes clouded with film. The healer you requested, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. But before I touch your skin, Alpha, there is a poison in this room more deadly than your curse. It is a lie that has rotted your pack for a decade. I turned my gaze to Marlowe. She was shaking, her fingers twisting the fabric of her expensive cloak. Tell them, Marlowe, I commanded. My power flared, a low hum of silver energy that made the torches on the walls burn brighter. Tell them where the orphan girl went 10 years ago. She ran. Marlowe started, her voice cracking. Lies! Caspian's voice boomed, his alpha presence slamming into the room like a physical blow. He pulled a weathered, ink-stained ledger from his tunic, the record he had stolen from his father's study years ago. This is the bill of sale, signed by Marlowe of the Silverpaw Pack and Silas of the Deadlands. 8 years of a child's life sold for 50 bars of gold. A collective gasp ripped through the council. The Alpha's eyes widened, looking toward Marlowe in horror. I did it for us, Marlowe shrieked, her mask finally shattering. She was a freak. She wasn't shifting. She was a drain on our resources. I took the gold and put it into the pack's winter stores. I saved you all. You didn't save them, I said, stepping toward her. My eyes were now glowing with a terrifying liquid silver. You sold the only person who could have cured the Alpha 10 years ago. You chose gold over blood. I turned to the dying Alpha. I placed my hand on his chest. The silver fire surged, not as a gentle hum, but as a roaring tide of purification. The black veins on his neck turned silver, then vanished, the room filled with the scent of ozone and fresh rain. Garrett let out a violent cough, a cloud of black soot erupting from his lungs, followed by a deep, clear breath. He sat up, his strength returning in a sudden, violent rush. He looked at his hands, then at me, then at Marlowe. The law of the pack is clear, Alpha Garrett rasped, his voice regaining its command. Betrayal of a packmate, especially a child, is punishable by the void. No! Marlowe screamed as 2 warriors grabbed her arms. Lyra, please! I'm your family! You were never my family, I said, my voice cold and final. You were the merchant, and today your debt is settled. Marlowe was dragged from the hall, her screams fading as she was taken to the border, the same border where she had sold me. She was to be stripped of her rank and banished into the Deadlands with nothing but the clothes on her back. The Alpha turned to me, bowing his head. Lyra, we owe you a debt we can never repay. Stay. Take your rightful place as the High Healer. This is your home. I looked at Caspian. He was watching me, waiting for my choice, his hand ready to reach for mine. I looked back at the Alpha and then at the pack members who had watched me be mistreated for years and done nothing. No, I said firmly. This was my prison. My home is the Silver-Spires. My home is with the people who saw my worth when I had nothing. I reached out and took Caspian's hand. But I will leave you with this, I added, the silver fire glowing one last time. The strange power you feared wasn't a curse. It was a gift from the goddess, and if you ever sell another soul for gold, the moon will remember, and so will I. Chapter 6. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming night cereus and the clean, metallic tang of the mountain air. Tonight was the festival of the first shift, a celebration for the young wolves of the spires. But for Caspian and me, it was something much deeper. I stood in my private chambers, looking at the heavy silver collar that sat on my vanity. It wasn't a slave's chain. It was the mark of the sovereign, forged from the very star iron I had purified with my own hands. You're overthinking it again. A deep voice rumbled from the doorway. I turned to see Caspian. He was dressed in charcoal leathers, his alpha mantle pinned with a silver brooch shaped like a howling wolf. He looked older, more settled, but the way he looked at me, with a hunger that had nothing to do with greed and everything to do with devotion, had never changed. I'm not a slave anymore, Caspian, I said, my hand trailing over the cool metal. But am I a leader? The people look to me as a goddess, but I'm just the girl who survived the cellar. Caspian crossed the room, his boots silent on the stone floor. He took the silver collar from the table and stepped behind me, his warmth radiating through my silk gown. You are the girl who took the fire that was meant to consume her and used it to light the way for others, he whispered, his breath warm against my neck. That is what makes a queen. He clicked the silver collar around my neck. It hummed against my skin, vibrating in harmony with the silver fire in my veins. Tonight, Caspian said, turning me to face him, I don't just claim you as my mate before the pack. I claim you as the heart of this mountain. We rule together, Lyra. Equal in blood, equal in power. We stepped out onto the grand balcony. Thousands of wolves stood below, their torches creating a sea of amber light in the valley. The silence that fell was absolute, a silence of profound respect. Caspian stepped forward, his voice amplified by his alpha power, echoing off the mountain peaks. 5 years ago, this mountain was a place of iron and ash, he roared. Today it is a home, and the one who brought the light back is not a merchant's prize. She is not an orphan of the Silverpaw. She is the Luna of the Silver-Spires. He reached out, taking my hand and lifting it high. My skin began to glow, the silver fire lancing upward into the night sky, creating a pillar of moonlight that rivaled the stars. I, Caspian of the Spires, claim Lyra as my fated mate, my partner, and my queen. Let any who object speak now, or forever bow to the moon blessed. The roar that erupted from the crowd was deafening. It was the sound of 1,000 souls finally feeling safe. But as the cheers reached a crescendo, a sudden piercing howl cut through the celebration. It wasn't a howl of joy. It was a challenge, cold, ancient, and bone-chilling. From the dark ridges of the northern peaks, a line of massive, dark wolves appeared. Their eyes weren't gold or blue, but a sickly, glowing red. At their center stood a wolf the size of a grizzly bear, his fur matted with frozen blood. A touching display, a voice boomed. carried by a dark wind magic that rivaled my own. But the Moonblessed does not belong to a boy playing king. She belongs to the strongest, and I have come to claim my prize. The celebration turned to a battle line in an instant. Caspian stepped in front of me, his claws unsheathing, his wolf growling deep in his chest. The final test had arrived. It wasn't enough to survive the past. We had to defend the future. "You speak of claiming," Caspian hissed, his body coiled like a spring. "But Lyra is not a territory to be conquered. She is the fire that will burn you to ash if you take another step." Vane laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "I don't want her heart, boy. I want the star iron in her veins. Imagine an army that cannot be wounded, blades that never dull. With her, I won't just rule the mountains, I'll rule the world." He shifted mid-leap, a blur of shadow and fur. The battle erupted. The Iron Fang wolves surged forward like a dark tide, clashing with the Silver-Spire guards. The valley was filled with the sounds of snarling, the scent of wet fur, and the metallic ring of star iron clashing against bone. Caspian met Vane in the air. The two alphas collided with a force that sent a shockwave through the stone balcony. They were a whirlwind of teeth and claws, Caspian's golden speed against Vane's brute, ancient strength. I watched as Vane pinned Caspian against the parapet, his massive jaws snapping inches from Caspian's throat. "You're weak," Vane growled. "You love her. Love makes you soft. It makes you hesitant." I felt the silver fire within me surge. For years I had been used as a tool for others. I had been sold, exploited, and hunted. I looked at Caspian, the boy who had smuggled me books, the man who had burned his hands to save me. Love didn't make him soft. It made him a shield, and it was time I became the sword. "Get away from him!" I roared. I didn't just shift. I ascended. My white wolf form didn't just appear. It radiated a light so intense that the Iron Fang wolves were blinded. I lunged, not with teeth, but with a burst of pure, purifying energy. When I struck Vane, it wasn't a physical blow. The silver fire entered his spirit, seeking out the impurities, the bloodlust, the dark magic he used to control his pack, the cruelty that fueled his strength. Vane screamed as the darkness was burned out of him. His massive form shrunk, his red eyes fading to a dull, frightened brown. He collapsed onto the stone, no longer an alpha, just a man stripped of the shadows he used to hide his cowardice. The Iron Fang wolves, seeing their leader broken, not by force, but by light, ceased their attack. One by one, they lowered their heads. The claiming was over, not because Caspian had killed a rival, but because I had ended the war before it could truly begin. Caspian stood up, panting, his shoulder bleeding, but his eyes bright with pride. He walked over to my massive, glowing form and rested his hand on my neck. "It's over, Lyra," he whispered. "The last chain is broken." I shifted back, falling into his arms. The silver fire was finally quiet, not because it was gone, but because it was finally at peace. The orphan had not just been claimed, she had claimed herself. The Epilogue. The morning sun crept over the jagged peaks, but it was the fading moonlight that still held the true magic of the spires. I stood at the edge of the royal gardens, once a barren rock face, now a lush sanctuary of silver-leafed trees and flowers that bloomed only under the stars. I was 23 now. The scars on my hands from the wash tunnels had faded into thin, white lines that looked like silk threads. The heavy silver collar was gone, replaced by a simple pendant of star iron that rested against my collarbone. I didn't need a crown to be recognized. The very air seemed to shimmer whenever I walked by. "You're up early," a voice rumbled. I didn't need to turn to know it was Caspian. His scent, rain-damp earth and mountain pine, was the only thing that felt more like home than the spires themselves. He wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me back against his chest. His touch was no longer the desperate grip of a boy trying to save a slave. It was the steady, unwavering strength of a king holding his heart. "I was thinking about the Silverpaw pack," I whispered, leaning my head back against his shoulder. "I heard a traveler mention them in the market yesterday. They say their lands have finally begun to heal. But Marlowe, she was never seen again after she crossed into the Deadlands." Caspian tightened his hold slightly. "Justice has a long memory, Lyra. She chose the darkness, and the darkness kept her. But look at what you've built in her place." He gestured to the valley below. The spires were no longer a fortress of isolation. A thriving city had grown at the base of the mountain. We had abolished the caste system of alphas and omegas. Here, a wolf's worth wasn't measured by the strength of their jaw, but by the kindness of their spirit. We had built schools for the orphans, infirmaries for the elders, and a forge where star iron was used to create tools of life, not just weapons of war. Suddenly, a streak of white fur blurred through the garden. A young pup, no more than 6 years old, tumbled over a patch of moon lilies. She shifted back into a human girl with messy chestnut hair and bright, inquisitive eyes. She looked up at us, her knees stained with grass, a toothy grin on her face. "Mama, look! I shifted for 3 whole minutes today," she chirped, holding up a small, glowing stone she had found. I knelt down, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. Her name was Selene. She was the first child born of our union, a child born in freedom. 3 minutes is a long time, little moon. Soon you'll be running faster than the wind. "Will I be a healer like you?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "You will be whatever you choose to be," I said softly, kissing her brow. "That is the law of this mountain." As she ran off to play with the other children, I felt a familiar hum in my veins. The silver fire was still there, but it no longer felt like a burning curse or an exploitable battery. It felt like a warm hearth, a steady glow that sustained me. Caspian took my hand, his thumb tracing the pulse at my wrist. "We did it, Lyra. The girl from the cellar and the boy who hated his father's house. We changed the stars." "We didn't just change them," I said, looking up as the first true ray of sunlight hit the peak of the tower, turning the white stone into gold. "We claimed them." The orphan of the Silverpaw had been sold for 50 bars of gold, but she had discovered that her true value was immeasurable. I was no longer a ghost in a hallway or a prisoner in a gilded cage. I was the moon-blessed queen, and as long as I breathed, no child in these mountains would ever be told they were a mistake. The cycle of pain was broken, the moon was full, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the next blow. I was simply home. And that is the grand finale of The Moon's Stolen Spark. From the cold betrayal at the park to the soaring heights of the Silver-Spires, thank you for riding this emotional roller coaster with me. Thank you for staying until the final sunset. If this ending gave you the feels, make sure to smash that like button to celebrate Lyra's victory. New to the pack? If you just found us, there are so many more stories waiting for you. Hit that subscribe button and join our global family so you never miss a new legend. Where in the world are you watching from? I want to give a final shout out to our global viewers. Whether you're in the US, UK, Nigeria, Philippines, or anywhere else, drop your country in the comments. Let me know your final thoughts. If you could say one thing to Marlowe or Silas right now, what would it be? And who was your favorite side character? Let's have one last big discussion in the comments.